I paddled out further, chasing the perfect wave, blissfully unaware of the danger. Below me, the water stirred, darker and colder than before. A dorsal fin sliced the surface, a warning too late to heed. The wave came, but so did the teeth. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The Gulf of Mexico stretched out in a shimmering expanse of blue-green water, the horizon merging imperceptibly with the sky. Mike Zorn, a seasoned sailor of 35, adjusted the mainsail of his modest sailboat, undersaw the Wayfinder undersaw with practiced ease. The breeze was steady, warm, and tinged with salt, perfect for the solitude he sought. Mike wasn't running away from anything specific, or so he told himself. The truth was murkier. Life had been wearing him down, his father's recent passing, the divorce finalized just 3 months ago, and the creeping sense that life was passing him by. The Gulf seemed a fitting place to lose himself for a while, to shed the weight and drift. "All right, you stubborn beauty," he muttered, patting the boat's worn railing. "Just you and me. Let's make this a trip to remember." As the afternoon wore on, Mike settled into a rhythm. The Gulf was calm, almost tranquil, but he noticed the occasional erratic gust that whipped at the sails. He chalked it up to the unpredictability of open water and kept his course steady, enjoying the solitude. The first sign of trouble came with the radio. Static interrupted the soft hum of the small onboard system, and Mike frowned, tapping the old device. "Come on, don't do this now," he muttered. The crackling persisted, and any semblance of a clear signal was gone. Mike sighed, setting the device aside. He figured he could fix it later when the wind wasn't so demanding. The engine sputtered briefly, a cough of protest that sent his pulse quickening, but it quickly settled again. "Great," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone. "Let's just add mechanical issues to the mix." What else? By late afternoon, the horizon to the west had shifted. Dark clouds gathered with unnerving speed, their edges tinged with an ominous green. The air felt heavier, charged, and Mike's sailor instincts kicked in. "Not today," he muttered, standing to secure the sails. The once pleasant breeze was growing erratic, tugging at the rigging like an impatient child. He worked quickly, his hands moving with the precision of years of experience. The first raindrop struck his cheek, cold and sharp, followed by another. The Gulf's surface churned, gentle waves turning into sharper crests. Mike tightened his grip on the tiller, his heart pounding in rhythm with the rising wind. "All right, stay calm," he muttered, though his voice betrayed his growing unease. He glanced back at the horizon. The storm was advancing faster than he'd anticipated, a rolling wall of chaos consuming the sky. He fought the tiller as the wind grew fiercer, whipping the sails into a frenzy. Crack. A belt of lightning illuminated the clouds, stark and terrifying against the darkening sky. Thunder followed, a low rumble that vibrated through his chest. The first real wave struck the boat, a heavy slap that sent the Wayfinder rocking violently. "Damn it," Mike hissed, gripping the railing for balance. He scrambled to secure loose items and double-checked his life preserver. The storm wasn't going to wait for him to get his bearings. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as the storm bore down on him. The boat creaked under the strain, each wave hitting harder than the last. Sheets of rain blurred his vision, and the wind howled like a living thing. "Hold together, girl," he shouted against the storm. "Just hold together." But nature had no intention of relenting. A massive wave loomed ahead, its peak curling ominously. Mike braced himself, gripping the tiller with white-knuckled hands. The wave hit like a freight train, and everything went sideways literally. Mike was thrown against the railing as the boat capsized, water rushing in a chaotic torrent. He barely had time to react before he was submerged, the freezing salt water tearing him away from the wreckage. Disoriented, Mike clawed his way to the surface, gasping for air. The storm raged around him, the overturned hull of _ the Wayfinder _ barely visible through the rain and foam. He swam desperately, adrenaline dulling the pain of his battered body. "Come on," he shouted hoarsely, reaching for a piece of floating debris. It took every ounce of his strength to haul himself onto a fragment of the boat's hull. Gasping, he clung to the makeshift raft, his chest heaving with each breath. The storm showed no mercy, the waves tossing him like a toy, but he refused to let go. Hours passed before the storm began to relent, the wind dying to a whisper and the waves settling into a rhythmic swell. Exhausted, Mike lay sprawled on the raft, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The world around him was eerily quiet, the storm's fury replaced by a haunting stillness. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Mike forced himself to sit up, his muscles protesting with every movement. His gaze swept the endless expanse of water, and his stomach sank. There was no sign of rescue, no sign of land, just him, the debris, and the open gulf. "Okay," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You've made it through the worst. Now you survive." He took stock of his situation. The raft was sturdy enough for now, but he had no food, no water, and no means of signaling for help. The radio was gone, and the storm had claimed most of his supplies. He searched the wreckage, finding a piece of metal he could use as a makeshift paddle. By mid-morning, the sun was relentless, beating down on him with unrelenting intensity. Sweat dripped from his brow as he tried to keep his bearings. Every so often, he dipped a hand into the water to cool himself, the salty sting a bitter reminder of his predicament. It was then that he saw it, a shadow beneath the surface, sleek and purposeful. Mike froze, his heart skipping a beat. The shadow moved with eerie grace, circling the raft before disappearing into the depths. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not now." The shadow returned, larger this time, its dorsal fin cutting through the surface like a knife. The tiger shark. Mike's breath caught in his throat as the predator glided closer, its striped body a stark contrast against the blue. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The shark swam lazily, almost indifferent to him, but Mike knew better. It was assessing, waiting. He reached for the metal paddle, gripping it tightly. "Stay calm," he muttered, though his hands trembled. "Don't panic. Don't act like prey." The shark disappeared again, its fin sinking below the surface. Mike's eyes darted across the water, searching for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. And then, without warning, it breached the water a few feet from the raft, its jaws snapping shut on a piece of debris before vanishing again. Mike's pulse thundered in his ears as he tightened his grip on the paddle. This was no storm. This was something far worse. The Gulf was eerily quiet in the wake of the storm. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the makeshift raft as Mike Thorne clung to his fragile sanctuary. The sun was a brutal overseer, already climbing high into the sky, its heat searing his skin. Salt encrusted his lips, and his throat was dry to the point of pain. Every breath was a labor, every movement an effort. He scanned the horizon for the 100th time, desperate for a sign of life. Another vessel, a plane, even a gull that might signal land wasn't too far off. But the sea stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken expanse of blue and green. "Help's coming," he whispered hoarsely, more to himself than anyone. "They have to know I'm out here. Someone will see me." Even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He wasn't sure how far the storm had carried him, and the gulf was vast and unforgiving. Mike tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the makeshift paddle he'd fashioned from a piece of debris. He dipped it into the water, moving with slow, deliberate strokes to conserve energy. The first shadow appeared just as he was shifting his position to rest. It was subtle at first, a flicker beneath the surface, There and gone before he could be certain of what he'd seen. Mike froze, his heart suddenly pounding harder than it had during the storm. "What the hell?" she muttered, leaning over the side of the raft. The water was deceptively clear, sunlight cutting deep into the turquoise depths. He stared for a long moment, his eyes darting over the endless shifting patterns of light and shadow. And then he saw it again. A sleek, muscular form glided below, a shape so large it made his chest tighten. It was unmistakable this time, a tiger shark, its stripes visible even in the watery distortion. It moved with unnerving grace, circling the raft in a slow, deliberate arc. "No, no, no," Mike whispered, his voice cracking. His grip tightened on the edge of the raft, his knuckles white. The shark vanished as quickly as it had appeared, sinking into the blue. Mike's breathing was shallow and rapid, his gaze darting across the surface. For a brief moment, the stillness returned, but it was no longer comforting. The silence was heavy now, filled with unseen danger. Mike's mind raced. He'd read about sharks before, watched enough documentaries to know that tiger sharks were opportunistic predators. They were known for their curiosity, for testing unfamiliar objects in their environment. A capsized sailor on a flimsy raft? That was probably as interesting as it got. "You're not food," he muttered to himself, gripping his makeshift paddle. "You're not food." But as the minutes stretched into agonizing silence, his resolve began to waver. He couldn't see the shark anymore, and that made it worse. Was it still circling below? Was it preparing to strike? Every time a shadow moved across the water, his pulse jumped. A sudden splash behind him made Mike whip around, nearly losing his balance. His heart leapt into his throat as he spotted the dorsal fin slicing through the surface. It moved with terrifying precision, leaving a small wake as it circled closer. "Oh, come on," he shouted, his voice a mix of fear and anger. "Go away. Just leave me alone." The shark didn't react, its massive body gliding just below the surface. Mike could see its pale underbelly now, its sharp, dead eyes fixed on the raft. It was close enough that he could make out the rough texture of its skin, the faint scars along its flank. Mike raised the paddle, gripping it tightly with both hands. His palms were slick with sweat, but he held his ground, his muscles coiled with tension. "I mean it," he yelled, jabbing the paddle toward the water. "Back off." The shark veered slightly, but it wasn't deterred. Instead, it began another slow circle, its movements deliberate, almost taunting. Mike could feel his adrenaline surging, his instincts screaming at him to do something, but what could he do? He was stranded, alone, with nothing but a flimsy raft between him and one of the ocean's apex predators. Hours dragged by. The shark didn't attack, but it didn't leave either. It circled at a maddeningly slow pace, occasionally diving out of sight before reappearing closer to the raft. Mike was on edge, his body and mind exhausted from the constant vigilance. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the water in hues of gold and crimson, the shark made its first move. It approached the raft head-on, its body half submerged. Mike braced himself, gripping the paddle so tightly his fingers ached. When the shark struck, it was with terrifying speed and force. Its powerful jaws closed on the edge of the raft, tearing a chunk of the wood away before retreating into the water. The impact sent Mike sprawling, his paddle slipping from his grasp. "Damn it!" he shouted, scrambling to retrieve the paddle. The shark came again, this time bumping the bottom of the raft with enough force to nearly flip it. Mike clung to the edges, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He jabbed at the water with the paddle, shouting incoherent curses, but the shark was unfazed. As night fell, Mike's terror took on a new dimension. The darkened waters were an endless abyss, hiding the predator below. He couldn't see the shark anymore, but he knew it was still there. Every sound, the slap of a wave, the creak of the raft, set his nerves on edge. He huddled in the center of the raft, clutching the paddle like a lifeline. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear and desperation. Could he last another night? Would help ever come? Was this how it ended? Trees, he whispered, his voice breaking. Someone, anyone. The shark breached again, its dorsal fin cutting through the moonlit water like a blade. Mike stared at it, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. His body was failing, his spirit cracking under the relentless pressure. But even as despair threatened to consume him, a flicker of determination sparked within. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He would fight, tooth and nail, for every second of life. "You're not taking me," he said aloud, his voice steady for the first time in hours. "Not today." With the paddle in hand, he faced the darkened waters, waiting for the next move. The shark was patient, but so was he. The morning sun rose over the Gulf of Mexico, casting long shadows across the restless sea. Mike Thorne sat hunched on his raft, his muscles stiff from a sleepless night of clinging to his makeshift sanctuary. His throat was parched, his lips cracked, and his entire body ached from tension. Yet his eyes never left the water. Somewhere below, the tiger shark lurked, its patience circling a reminder of the unforgiving predator waiting to strike. "I've survived worse," Mike muttered under his breath, though even as he said it, doubt crept in. He had survived the storm, but this was different. This wasn't just nature's fury. This was a predator relentless and calculating, treating him as prey. The first sign of the shark's return was subtle. A flicker of movement beneath the surface, a ripple that didn't match the rhythm of the waves. Mike tensed, his grip tightening around the makeshift paddle in his hands. His eyes darted across the water, scanning for the telltale dorsal fin. "Come on," he whispered. "Show yourself." The shark didn't disappoint. The dorsal fin broke the surface, slicing through the water like a knife. It was larger than Mike had realized, its powerful body propelling it with terrifying ease. The shark glided closer, its movements almost lazy, as though it knew there was no rush. Mike's heart raced as the predator approached the raft. He shifted his weight, trying to maintain balance, and raised the paddle like a spear. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The shark didn't flinch. Instead, it began a slow circle around the raft, its dark eyes fixed on him. Mike jabbed the paddle into the water, splashing aggressively in an attempt to scare it off. "I mean it," he yelled. "Get away from me." The shark's response was chilling. It swam closer, bumping the underside of the raft with enough force to send Mike sprawling onto his back. The raft creaked ominously, the edges of the wooden planks splintering from the impact. Mike scrambled to his knees, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then came the first strike. With a sudden burst of speed, the shark lunged at the raft, its powerful jaws snapping shut around one of the planks. The sound of splintering wood was deafening. Mike screamed, gripping the paddle with white-knuckled hands as he swung it downward with all his strength. "Get off!" he roared, striking the shark's snout. The shark thrashed, releasing the plank, and dove beneath the surface. Mike's breaths came in ragged gasps as he steadied himself. The damaged raft rocked violently, water sloshing over the edges. He knew the shark wasn't done. It was testing him, testing the raft, preparing for the next assault. "All right," he muttered, his voice trembling. "You want to fight? Let's see how you like this." The second attack came minutes later. The shark surfaced again, this time aiming for the side of the raft where Mike sat. It rammed the makeshift vessel with terrifying force, nearly flipping it over. Mike was thrown off balance, his paddle slipping from his grasp and tumbling into the water. "No, no, no," he shouted, reaching for the paddle as it floated away. But the shark was faster. In a horrifying display of power, the shark snapped its jaws around the paddle, splintering it in two. It thrashed its massive body, sending fragments of wood scattering across the surface. Mike's heart sank as he realized his only weapon was gone. The shark circled again, its dorsal fin cutting a wide arc around the raft. Mike grabbed a loose piece of wood, a jagged shard from the damaged raft, and held it like a dagger. His hands trembled as he crouched, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered through clenched teeth. "You're not taking me. Not like this." The shark seemed to sense his defiance. It slowed its circling, its movements more deliberate now, as though assessing its prey. Mike's mind raced, replaying every survival tip he'd ever read or heard about sharks. Stay calm, don't splash, keep eye contact if possible. The calm was a luxury he couldn't afford. His body was running on adrenaline and sheer willpower, and his thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear and desperation. The third strike was the most brutal. The shark lunged at the raft again, this time breaching halfway out of the water. Its massive jaws clamped onto the edge of the raft, pulling it downward. Mike screamed as water flooded the raft, soaking him to the bone. He stabbed at the shark's gills with the jagged wood, his movements frantic. "Get off! Get off!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. The shark thrashed violently, nearly ripping the raft apart. Mike's makeshift weapon struck home, and the shark released its grip, disappearing beneath the surface. The damage was done, though. The raft was barely holding together, chunks of wood missing, and water pooling around Mike's knees. He collapsed onto the remnants of the raft, his chest heaving. His hands were bloodied from gripping the jagged wood, and his entire body ached. He stared at the water, half expecting the shark to return at any moment. The ocean was deceptively calm now, the surface reflecting the golden light of the rising sun. Mike's breath slowed as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind an overwhelming exhaustion. He knew he couldn't last much longer. The shark had the advantage, and he was running out of time and options. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Someone, anyone, help me." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the waves and the creak of the damaged raft. Then, in the distance, he heard a faint hum, a sound that sent a jolt of hope through his battered body. Plain. It was faint, barely visible against the brightening sky, but it was there. Mike struggled to his feet, waving his arms and shouting with what little strength he had left. "Over here!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "I'm here." The plane continued on its course, its silhouette growing smaller as it disappeared over the horizon. Mike sank to his knees, the brief flicker of hope extinguished. The shark's fin surfaced again, a dark shadow against the shimmering water. Mike watched it with a mixture of dread and resignation. He was out of weapons, out of strength, and out of time. The predator circled closer, its movements deliberate and unhurried. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the gulf, Mike prepared for what he knew was coming. The fight wasn't over, but he was running out of moves. Still, he gripped the jagged wood tightly, ready to face whatever came next. "You're not taking me," he muttered, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Not without a fight." And as the shark circled closer, the battle for survival continued. The sun bore down on the Gulf of Mexico, its unforgiving rays reflecting off the water like shards of glass. Mike Thorne's arms were weak, his body trembling from exhaustion and dehydration. The jagged shard of wood he held as a makeshift weapon dug into his blistered hands, but he refused to let go. Below him, the tiger shark continued its relentless circling, the apex predator asserting its dominance over the flimsy raft and its lone occupant. "All right, big guy," Mike muttered, his voice hoarse from the salt and sun. "You want me that bad? Come and get me." He didn't know where the surge of defiance came from. His body felt broken, his hope as fragile as the raft beneath him. But something inside him, the stubbornness, the primal instinct to survive, refused to yield. The shark's fins sliced through the water like a knife, disappearing beneath the surface as it made another pass. Mike's eyes followed the faint shadow beneath the waves, his knuckles white against the jagged wood. His breathing was shallow, each inhale burning his dry throat. Then it came a bump from below. The force lifted the raft slightly, spilling seawater across its splintered surface and soaking Mike's legs. "Damn it!" he hissed, bracing himself as the raft rocked violently. The shark was testing him, probing for weakness. Mike knew this wasn't just random behavior. This was calculated, the shark's instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. It wasn't in a hurry. It had all the time in the world. The next strike was more aggressive. The shark rammed the raft with its snout, splintering another piece of wood. Mike barely held on, the force nearly throwing him into the water. "Stop it!" he shouted, slamming the shard into the water in a futile gesture. "Leave me alone." The shark's dorsal fin surfaced again, cutting a tight circle around the raft. Its movements were faster now, more deliberate. Mike's breath caught as the fin disappeared once more, the predator vanishing into the depths. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The tension was unbearable. "Where are you?" Mike whispered, scanning the water. The answer came in an instant. The shark breached the water on the far side of the raft, its massive body partially airborne. Its jaws snapped shut around the edge of the raft, pulling it down with incredible force. Mike screamed, stabbing at the shark's head with his makeshift weapon. The jagged wood scraped against the rough skin near its gills, and the shark thrashed violently, releasing the raft. Mike scrambled to the center of the raft, his chest heaving. Water pulled around him, and the structure felt more fragile than ever. One more hit like that, and it would come apart completely. "Sink, Mike, sink," he muttered, his mind racing. His survival training was limited, but he remembered one crucial detail. Sharks were most vulnerable around their gills and eyes. If it came to a direct attack, those were his only targets. The shark wasn't finished. It circled again, its fin visible, its intent unmistakable. Mike tried to calm his trembling hands, forcing himself to focus. He knew he couldn't outrun it, couldn't outlast it. His only option was to fight back. As the shark charged again, Mike waited until the last possible second. It rammed the raft, splintering another section, and lunged upward with its massive jaws open wide. Mike thrust his weapon toward its head, aiming for the eyes. The jagged wood struck near its snout, just shy of its target. The shark recoiled, diving beneath the surface. Mike fell back onto the raft, gasping for breath. His weapon had broken in half, leaving him with a shorter, even less reliable piece of wood. "Great," he muttered bitterly. "That'll scare it off." The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows across the water. The temperature began to drop, but the shark showed no signs of relenting. It circled with the same eerie persistence, its fins slicing through the water with unnerving precision. "Okay," Mike said aloud, his voice shaking. "What's the plan here? Duh, you just going to keep it this until I fall apart?" The shark, of course, didn't answer. Its fin disappeared again, the predator slipping back into the depths. Mike stared at the water, his heart pounding. He knew it was coming back. It always came back. He clutched the broken shard of wood, his fingers cramping from the strain. "All right," he said through gritted teeth. "One more round." When the shark struck again, it was from below. The force of the impact sent the raft flying upward, throwing Mike into the water. The shock of the cold engulfed him, momentarily paralyzing him. He sputtered, kicking frantically to reach the surface. "No!" he screamed as he broke through the waves, gasping for air. He grabbed a piece of the shattered raft, his arms burning with effort. The shark's shadow loomed beneath him, growing larger as it approached. "Stay away," Mike yelled, splashing the water with one hand while gripping the debris with the other. "Stay the hell away." The shark came closer, its massive body gliding just below the surface. Its cold, lifeless eyes seemed to bore into him, calculating, assessing. This is it, Mike thought. This is where it ends. As the shark lunged, Mike acted on pure instinct. He kicked hard, propelling himself to the side, and slammed the broken shard of wood into the shark's gills. The predator thrashed violently, its body twisting in a spray of foam and blood. Mike clung to the debris, his body trembling as the shark retreated. For the first time, it seemed to hesitate. Its movements were slower, less certain. It circled once more before sinking back into the depths. Mike hauled himself onto what remained of the raft, his chest heaving. His entire body ached, and his hands were slick with blood, his own or the shark's. He couldn't tell. The water around him was tinged red, a stark reminder of how close he'd come to death. Nightfall brought a haunting silence to the gulf. The shark didn't return, but Mike knew better than to assume he was safe. He sat huddled in the center of the raft, his arms wrapped around his knees. Every sound, the slap of a wave, the creak of the wood, sent his nerves into overdrive. "Someone has to be looking for me," he whispered. "They have to be." The stars above were cold and distant, offering no comfort. Mike closed his eyes, willing himself to stay awake. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The shark might return, or the elements might finish what the predator started. But for now, he was alive, and as long as he was alive, he would fight. The first light of dawn crept over the Gulf of Mexico, painting the horizon in soft hues of pink and orange. For Mike Zorn, it was both a relief and a cruel reminder. He'd survived another night, but the endless expanse of ocean still surrounded him. The fragile remains of his raft floated precariously, its wood waterlogged and splintering further with every passing hour. His body ached, his lips were cracked, and his hands, blistered and raw, could barely grip the edges of the raft. Mike squinted into the distance, his eyes bloodshot from the salt and strain. Every direction looked the same, a flat, unbroken expanse of blue. "Someone has to see me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're looking for me. They have to be." But even as he said it, the hopelessness of his situation crept in. How far had the storm pushed him? Was he even still in a shipping lane or near a rescue route? The questions gnawed at him, but he forced himself to focus. He wasn't dead yet, and he wouldn't die sitting here doing nothing. Dragging himself to a seated position, Mike rummaged through the debris still clinging to the raft. Most of what had once been on _ the Wayfinder _ was gone, claimed by the storm or the shark. His fingers brushed against something smooth and cylindrical, and his heart leapt. It was one of the emergency flares. "Yes," he croaked, holding it up like a trophy. Finally, something. The flare felt heavier than he expected, a small miracle in the sea of despair that surrounded him. He inspected it carefully, noting the faded label and rusted cap. "Please work," he whispered, turning the cap with trembling hands. With the flare ready, Mike glanced at the sky. It was clear, the sun climbing steadily, its light refracting off the water in blinding flashes. He twisted around on the raft, searching for any sign of a passing vessel, a plane, or anything that might see the flare. His eyes settled on the distant horizon. There was a dark speck? He couldn't be sure. The heat rising off the water made the air shimmer, distorting his vision. Okay, he muttered, trying to steady his nerves. "You see something, you shoot." He gripped the flare tightly, aiming it upward. His thumb hovered over the ignition. "Trees!" He sucked in a deep breath. "Let this work." The flare erupted with a loud _ sending a burst of red light streaking into the sky. The crackling hiss filled the air, the smoke trailing behind the bright arc. Mike's heart pounded as he watched it climb, burning fiercely against the blue backdrop. "Come on," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Someone see it, please." The flare's light began to fade, the smoke dissipating into the sky. Mike stared at the horizon, willing the speck he'd seen to grow larger, to resolve into a ship or a plane. But nothing changed. The dark shape remained distant, unmoving. No, he muttered, his hands clenching into fists. "You can't be serious." He sank back onto the raft, his body sagging with exhaustion. The flare had been his best shot, and now it was gone. Hours passed, The sun climbed higher, its relentless heat beating down on him. His skin was burned and peeling, every movement sending a wave of pain through his body. He tried to conserve energy, lying still and closing his eyes, but the first clawed at his throat, and the fear of the shark's return kept him on edge. The faint hum reached him just as he was slipping into a restless daze. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder. Mike's eyes snapped open, his ears straining. "A plane," he whispered, sitting up abruptly. "It's a plane." He scrambled to his feet, the raft wobbling dangerously beneath him. Scanning the sky, he spotted a small aircraft cutting across the horizon, its silver wings glinting in the sunlight. "Over here!" he screamed, waving his arms frantically. "I'm here." The plane didn't change course. It continued on its path, steady and indifferent. Mike's heart sank as he realized it was too far away. They wouldn't see him. "No!" he shouted, his voice raw. "Look down here. I'm right here." He grabbed a piece of the broken raft and waved it wildly above his head. His arms ached with the effort, but he kept screaming, kept waving, until the plane disappeared into the distance. The silence that followed was deafening. Mike slumped back onto the raft, his chest heaving. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. The shark's dorsal fin broke the surface again just as Mike was catching his breath. It was closer this time, cutting a slow, deliberate circle around the raft. The sight of it reignited his fear, his muscles locking up as he watched the predator. "You again," he muttered, gripping another piece of debris as a weapon. "Haven't you had enough?" The shark didn't respond, of course. It simply continued its circling, a silent reminder that Mike's fight for survival was far from over. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Mike's hope flickered like the dying light. He was running out of strength, out of time. The thought of another night on the raft, with the shark lurking below, was almost too much to bear. But then he heard it, a different sound this time. A lay rumble, distinct from the hum of the plane earlier. His heart leapt as he turned toward the horizon. A boat. It was small, barely visible against the fading light, but it was heading in his direction. Mike forced himself upright, his entire body trembling with effort. He waved his arms, shouting with what little strength he had left. "Over here!" he screamed, his voice hoarse. "I'm here." The boat grew larger, its outline becoming clearer as it approached. Mike could make out the figures of people on board, their movements purposeful. They'd seen him. They were coming. The relief was overwhelming, and for the first time in days, Mike allowed himself to hope. As the boat drew closer, the shark made one final move. It lunged at the raft, its massive body breaching halfway out of the water. Mike screamed, scrambling backward as the raft tilted dangerously. "Help!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. "It's here." One of the figures on the boat raised a rifle, taking aim at the shark. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed across the water, and the shark thrashed violently before retreating into the depths. The boat pulled alongside the shattered remains of the raft, and strong hands reached out to pull Mike aboard. His body sagged with relief as he collapsed onto the deck, tears streaming down his sunburned face. "You're safe now," one of the rescuers said, their voice steady and reassuring. "We've got you." Mike nodded weakly, his voice failing him. The hum of the boat's engine filled his ears as they sped away, leaving the endless expanse of the Gulf and the nightmare it held behind. For the first time in days, Mike allowed himself to believe that he might survive. The rhythmic hum of the boat's engine provided a faint sense of security as Mike Thorne lay on the deck, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. Two rescuers hovered over him, one holding a water bottle while the other checked his vitals. Every fiber of his being screamed for rest, but his mind refused to let go of the terror he had just endured. The memory of the tiger shark's relentless circling was seared into his brain. "You're dehydrated." One of the rescuers, a man in his late 40s with weathered skin and a gruff voice, said. He offered Mike the water. "Drink this, slow sips." Mike reached for the bottle with trembling hands, spilling some of the precious liquid as he brought it to his lips. The cold water was a shock to his parched throat, but it was a welcome one. What's your name?" Mike croaked, his voice raw from screaming and thirst. "Captain Greg," the man replied, his gaze scanning the horizon. "You're lucky we spotted you. Not many people survive this far out." "Lucky?" Mike muttered bitterly, the word tasting like salt on his tongue. His gaze drifted to the blood-stained water where the shark had made its final charge. "It's still out there." The other rescuer, a younger man with a wiry frame, glanced over the edge of the boat. "Sharks like that don't just give up," he said, his voice laced with unease. "You heard it, yeah, but it's probably circling below." As if summoned by the words, a shadow appeared beneath the surface. It was massive, its form gliding effortlessly through the water. Mike's heart skipped a beat, and his grip tightened on the edge of the deck. "There!" he shouted, pointing with a trembling hand. "It's back!" Greg cursed under his breath, grabbing a harpoon gun from a storage locker. "I thought it might be. Stay down. Both of you. Do you think it's going to attack the boat?" the younger man asked, his voice rising with panic. "Not if I can help it," Greg replied, his tone calm but firm. Mike struggled to push himself up, his legs weak beneath him. "You don't understand," he rasped. "That thing doesn't quit. It's not just hungry, it's hunting me." Greg gave him a sharp look. "That's why you're staying out of its reach." The dorsal fin broke the surface, cutting through the water with terrifying speed. It circled the boat once, twice, and then disappeared again. The tension in the air was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity. Mike's breathing grew shallow, his body shaking as the shark's fin reappeared. "It's going to hit," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I know it's going to hit." Greg positioned himself at the edge of the boat, harpoon at the ready. The younger man, visibly shaking, grabbed a metal pole for defense. "If it comes close enough," Greg said, "I'll make sure it regrets it." The water beneath the boat churned suddenly, and the shark lunged. Its massive body struck the hull with a resounding thud, nearly knocking them off their feet. The boat rocked violently, water splashing onto the deck. "Damn it!" Greg shouted, steadying himself. He fired the harpoon, the weapon slicing through the air and into the water. It missed its mark, the shark vanishing into the depths before Greg could reload. "Didn't you get it?" the younger man asked, his voice tight with fear. "No," Greg growls, his hands working quickly to reload the harpoon gun. "It's still out there." Mike gritted his teeth, his frustration boiling over. "It's toying with us. You can't just scare it off, it's too smart for that." Greg turned to him, his expression grim. "You're right. Sharks like this don't scare easily. But we're not letting it take this boat, or you." The shark struck again, this time from below. The impact lifted the boat partially out of the water, sending all three men sprawling. Mike hit the deck hard, the taste of blood filling his mouth as he bit his lip. "We have to kill it," he shouted, struggling to his feet. "If we don't, it'll tear us apart." The younger man scrambled to the edge of the boat, peering into the water. "It's coming back," he yelled. "I can see it." Greg raised the harpoon gun again, his hands steady despite the chaos. The shark's massive body surged toward the boat, its jaws wide open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Greg fired, the harpoon finding its target this time. The shark thrashed violently, blood blooming in the water like a dark cloud. "Direct hit," Greg shouted, but his victory was short-lived. The shark's movements grew more erratic, its tail slamming against the hull with enough force to crack the wood. "It's going to sink us," the younger man screamed. "Keep it together," Greg barked, grabbing another harpoon. Mike, fueled by a mix of adrenaline and desperation, grabbed the metal pole the younger man had dropped. He positioned himself near the edge of the boat, his eyes locked on the thrashing predator. "We end this now," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The shark dove beneath the boat, disappearing into the dark water. The men braced themselves, knowing it would strike again. The weight was agonizing, every second dragging as they scanned the surface. "There!" Mike shouted as the fin reappeared, racing toward the boat with terrifying speed. The shark breached, its massive head rising out of the water as it lunged for the side of the boat. Mike swung the pole with all his strength, striking the shark near its eye. The predator recoiled, its body crashing back into the water with a tremendous splash. Greg fired the harpoon again, this time aiming for the shark's gills. The weapon struck true, and the shark's thrashing intensified, its blood turning the water a deep crimson. The predator's movements grew slower, its strength waning. Greg and Mike stood at the edge of the boat, their bodies trembling from the effort and fear. The younger man clung to the mast, his face pale as he watched the shark's deed. "Estol, it's done," Greg said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "It's finally done." Mike sank to his knees, his body giving out. Tears streamed down his face as the reality of their survival set in. "It's over," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's really over." Greg placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "You did good, kid. You fought like hell." The boat's engine roared to life as Greg guided them away from the blood-stained water. The horizon stretched out before them, the first hints of land visible in the distance. Mike leaned against the side of the boat, his eyes fixed on the fading fin as the shark's body sank into the depths. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe he might live to see another sunrise. But the memory of the tiger shark, its relentless pursuit and terrifying power, would haunt him forever. "We'll be home soon," Greg said, his voice carrying a quiet reassurance. "You're safe now." Mike nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. He was alive, but safety felt like a distant dream. The ocean, vast and unpredictable, had shown him just how fragile life could be. As the boat sped toward the horizon, Mike closed his eyes, the image of the shark's cold, lifeless eyes etched into his mind. He knew the scars, physical and emotional, would take a lifetime to heal, but for now he had survived, and that was enough. The boat churned through the water, its motor a steady hum against the backdrop of the vast and seemingly endless Gulf of Mexico. Mike Thorne sat slumped against the side of the boat, his legs stretched out on the blood-slicked deck. His arms hung limp at his sides, every ounce of energy drained from his battered body. The remains of the tiger shark's assault still clung to him, the salt water, the blood, and the sheer weight of fear that hadn't yet left his chest. Captain Greg steered with one hand on the throttle and the other gripping a handheld radio. The lines on his sun-weathered face deepened as he glanced toward Mike. "You're a tough son of a bitch, you know that?" Greg said, his tone a mix of admiration and weariness. Mike managed a weak laugh, though it sounded more like a cough. "Didn't feel tough out there. You're here, aren't you?" Greg replied. "That counts for something." The younger crewman, who had introduced himself as Eric, emerged from below deck carrying a first aid kit. His hands shook slightly as he knelt beside Mike, carefully unrolling a bandage. "Let me clean that up," Eric said, pointing to the cuts on Mike's arm. "Looks nasty." Mike winced as Eric dabbed at the wound with a cloth soaked in antiseptic. "I'll take nasty over dead," he muttered, his voice raspy from days without water. Eric gave him a nervous smile, his hands working quickly. "I don't know how you kept it together out there. That shark was... I've never seen anything like it." Mike's gaze drifted to the horizon. "You don't keep it together. You just survive." The hum of the boat's motor was interrupted by the crackle of Greg's radio. He lifted it to his mouth, his expression sharpening. "Mayday, this is Captain Greg of the Mariah Undersur. We've got a survivor of a shark attack aboard, injured but alive, requesting immediate medical assistance." There was a pause before a voice responded, tinny and distant. "Roger, Captain." Nearest Coast Guard vessel is 20 minutes out. Hold your position and prepare for transfer. Greg exhaled, a look of relief washing over his face. Copy that. Standing by, he turned toward Mike. Hear that? Coast Guard's on its way. You'll be in a hospital bed in no time. Mike nodded, though the thought of safety felt surreal. For days, survival had been his only goal. The idea of rescue, of stepping onto solid ground, seemed almost impossible to grasp. As they waited, Greg and Eric worked to stabilize the situation. Eric fetched water and a granola bar from their limited supplies, pressing them into Mike's hands. Eat, Eric insisted. You need your strength. Mike hesitated, the act of chewing feeling like an impossible task. But he forced himself to take a bite, the dry crumbs sticking to his parched throat. He followed it with a sip of water, savoring the coolness as it slid down. Greg leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon. You're lucky we were out here today, he said. Most boats wouldn't have ventured this far after a storm like that. Mike looked up at him, his face pale but determined. I wouldn't call anything about this lucky. Greg nodded slowly. Fair enough. The Coast Guard's arrival was announced by the roar of engines and the flashing of lights. A larger vessel, white and sleek, cut through the waves toward them. A crew of uniformed men and women stood ready on deck, their movements efficient and purposeful. Here we go, Greg said, signaling to the approaching vessel. As the Coast Guard boat came alongside, a boarding ladder was lowered. 2 officers climbed aboard, their eyes immediately assessing the situation. The leader, a woman with a calm demeanor and a sharp gaze, introduced herself. Lieutenant Kara Mitchell, she said. We're here to get you out of this mess. Kara crouched beside Mike, her voice steady but kind. You're Mike Soren, right? The sailor reported missing after the storm. Mike nodded weakly. That's me. She gave him an encouraging smile. Well, you've been through hell, but you're safe now. We're going to get you medical attention and back on land. Mike's voice cracked as he spoke. There was a shark in. It wouldn't stop. Kara's expression softened, though her professionalism remained intact. We've heard reports of tiger sharks in this area. Sounds like you encountered a particularly aggressive one. Mike clenched his fists, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Aggressive doesn't cover it. It was hunting me. Kara nodded, her tone soothing. I understand. Let's get you stabilized first. We'll debrief you later. The transfer to the Coast Guard vessel was tense. Mike's body ached as Eric and one of the Coast Guard officers helped him across the ladder. The larger boat felt solid beneath his feet, a stark contrast to the fragile raft that had been his lifeline. As soon as he was aboard, the medical team sprang into action. They laid him on a stretcher, checking his vitals and cleaning his wounds with precision. One of the medics, a man with a reassuring smile, introduced himself. I'm Officer Daniels. We're going to take care of you, all right? Mike nodded, his body too weak to protest. The cold sting of antiseptic on his cuts made him wince, but he was too relieved to care. As the medics worked, Kara approached Greg and Eric, her notepad in hand. Tell me what happened, she said. From the beginning. Greg crossed his arms, his expression grim. We were out checking equipment on the oil platforms when we spotted him. The raft was barely holding together, and that shark was all over him. Kara scribbled notes, her brow furrowed. Did you see the shark up close? Greg nodded. Biggest damn tiger shark I've ever seen. We harpooned it twice, and it still wouldn't stop. Eric chimed in, his voice shaky. It wasn't just attacking the raft, it was targeting him, like it wanted him specifically. Kara's eyes narrowed. Unusual behavior. We'll need to report this to the local marine biology center. Mike listened to the conversation from his stretcher, his mind racing. The image of the shark's cold, lifeless eyes flashed before him, and a shiver ran down his spine. You think it'll come back? He asked, his voice barely audible. Kara glanced at him, her expression serious. It's hard to say. Sharks like that are unpredictable. But you're safe now, Mike. That's what matters. Safe. The word felt hollow. Mike closed his eyes, the roar of the ocean still echoing in his ears. He wasn't sure he'd ever feel safe again. The Coast Guard vessel began its journey back to shore, the waves lapping against the hull in a steady rhythm. Mike stared at the ceiling of the cabin, his mind drifting between exhaustion and a desperate need for answers. Kara sat beside him, her notepad still in hand. "Mike, when you're ready, I'd like to hear your account. Every detail helps us understand what happened out there." He nodded slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's all a blur. The storm, the raft, and then the shark. It just kept coming. I thought I was going to die." Kara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But you didn't. You fought back. That says a lot about you." As the shoreline came into view, a wave of relief washed over Mike. He wasn't sure how long his recovery would take physically or mentally, but the sight of solid ground gave him a flicker of hope. "You're almost home," Kara said, her voice gentle. "Take it one step at a time." Mike nodded, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. One step at a time, and as the Coast Guard boat approached the dock, the nightmare of the Gulf began to fade, replaced by the faint glimmer of a new beginning. The hospital room was sterile and bright, the walls painted a bland shade of beige meant to comfort but succeeding only in feeling cold. Mike Thorne lay in the bed, his body propped up by stiff pillows and wrapped in blankets that felt heavier than his exhausted limbs could handle. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the only sound, a steady reminder that he was alive. The physical pain was manageable, the deep cuts and bruises from the shark attack and his days adrift were already beginning to heal under the care of doctors. But the mental scars ran far deeper. Every time Mike closed his eyes, he saw the tiger shark's dark, lifeless eyes staring back at him, its powerful body circling with deadly intent. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," a nurse said, walking in with a clipboard. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes that tried to mask the clinical efficiency of her movements. "How are you feeling today?" Mike's voice was hoarse when he answered. "Better, I guess. At least I'm not floating anymore." The nurse chuckled lightly, checking his foreline. "You've been through quite the ordeal. The doctors are impressed you made it out in one piece." "So am I," Mike muttered, his gaze drifting to the window. The view offered a sliver of the Gulf of Mexico in the distance, its calm waves betraying none of the terror he had endured. Later that morning, a pair of visitors arrived. Lieutenant Carr Mitchell from the Coast Guard and a marine biologist, Dr. Ethan Ralston. Kara's uniform was crisp, her demeanor calm as always, while Dr. Ralston had the slightly disheveled look of someone who spent more time in the field than at a desk. "Mike," Carr said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "How are you holding up?" Mike shrugged, wincing as the movement pulled at the stitches in his shoulder. "I've been better, but I guess I'm alive, so that's something." Dr. Ralston leaned against the wall, holding a small tablet. "It's more than something. Surviving an extended shark encounter like that is rare, to say the least." Mike turned to him, his tired eyes narrowing. "You mean most people don't?" Ralston hesitated before answering. "Tiger sharks are opportunistic predators. When they commit to something, they usually finish the job. What you described as shark hunting you specifically, ignoring easier prey that's almost unheard of." "Lucky me," Mike said dryly. Kara cut in, her tone gentle but firm. "We're here for two reasons, Mike. First, to make sure you're okay and to offer whatever support you need. Second, to document what happened so we can learn from it." Mike ran a hand through his unkempt hair, the strands damp with sweat. "What's there to learn? The shark wanted me and I didn't die. End of story." "It's not that simple," Ralston said, stepping closer. "Tiger sharks don't usually behave this way. They're aggressive, yes, but targeting a specific human like that, it's strange. I want to understand why." Mike's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Does it matter why? That happened. It's over." Kara placed a hand on his arm. "Mike, I know this is hard, But your story could help prevent something like this from happening again. What you experienced might give us insight into shark behavior or even maritime safety." He let out a long sigh, nodding reluctantly. "Fina, what do you need to know?" The next hour was grueling as Mike recounted the details of his ordeal. The storm, the capsized boat, the days on the raft, and the relentless attacks from the shark, it all came pouring out in disjointed fragments, his voice cracking more than once. "It wasn't just an animal out there," Mike said, his voice trembling. "It was like it had a vendetta. It wasn't eating me because it was hungry. It wanted me dead." Ralston tapped on his tablet, nodding thoughtfully. "Sharks don't hold grudges, Mike. But what you're describing, a single predator focusing on you, could be a case of mistaken identity or territorial behavior." "Territorial?" Mike scoffed. "I was floating on a piece of wood in the middle of nowhere. What territory? It's rare," Ralston admitted. "But sharks sometimes associate certain areas with food sources. It's possible the storm moved you into its hunting grounds." Mike stared at him, the scientist's explanation offering little comfort. "So I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Kara's voice softened. "You survived, Mike. That's what matters most." When they left, Mike's exhaustion was palpable. He leaned back against the pillows, closing his eyes and willing himself to find peace. But the images came rushing back, the fins slicing through the water, the shark's body breaching the surface, its jaws snapping shut inches from his face. His hands gripped the blanket tightly, his breath quickening. A nurse entered the room, alarmed. "Mr. Foran, are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. Mike forced himself to nod, though his entire body trembled. "Just memories." Over the next few days, the media frenzy began. News outlets caught wind of the story, a sailor surviving a tiger shark attack in the open Gulf, and reporters swarmed the hospital, their cameras and microphones an unwelcome reminder of the ordeal. Mike refused all interviews, his frustration mounting. He hated being treated like a spectacle. His suffering turned into entertainment. Only Greg and Eric visited him, their familiar faces a small comfort amid the chaos. "You're a celebrity now," Greg joked one afternoon, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Don't remind me," Mike muttered. "I didn't ask for any of this." Eric, standing awkwardly by the window, chimed in. "They're calling you the man who beat the shark." Mike scoffed. "Yeah, well, it doesn't feel like I won." The psychological toll of the attack became impossible to ignore. Nights were the worst every time Mike closed his eyes. He was back on the raft, the shark circling, its shadow a dark omen beneath the waves. He woke frequently, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. A counselor was assigned to him, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Maria Feldman. Their sessions were difficult at first, Mike hesitant to share the depth of his trauma. "It's normal to feel this way after what you've been through," Dr. Feldman said during their second meeting. "Your mind is trying to process a life-threatening event." "It's more than that," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the ocean isn't safe anymore. Every time I see it, I feel hunted." Dr. Feldman nodded, her expression empathetic. "That's a natural response to trauma, especially one tied to a specific environment. But it doesn't mean you can't heal." Ewing felt like a distant goal. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next. Mike's physical wounds healed faster than he expected, but his mind remained trapped in the Gulf, on that broken raft with the shark circling below. Kara visited him one last time before he was discharged. She handed him a thick envelope. "It's the official report," she said. "Everything we documented about the incident. You don't have to read it, but it's yours if you want it." Mike took the envelope, turning it over in his hands. "Thanks," he said quietly. Kara hesitated before speaking again. "You're stronger than you think, Mike. Don't forget that." On the day of his release, Mike stood at the hospital entrance, the salty breeze from the Gulf washing over him. He stared at the water in the distance, his chest tightening. "You ready?" Greg asked, standing beside him. Mike took a deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. "No," he admitted, "but I'll get there." And as he walked toward Greg's truck, leaving the hospital and the Gulf behind, Mike knew that his journey wasn't over. The shark might have disappeared into the depths, but its shadow would linger, a reminder of the thin line between life and death and the unrelenting will to survive. The sun hung low over the Gulf of Mexico, casting a golden glow on the water's surface. The waves, gentle now, lapped lazily against the hull of the small boat that Mike Thorne was aboard. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of tranquil landscape that only weeks ago Mike would have found beautiful. But now, as he stared out at the vast expanse of water, it only unsettled him. "Feels like home, doesn't it?" Craig, the captain of the boat, said, breaking Mike's reverie. Greg's voice was weathered and calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil Mike felt inside. Mike didn't respond immediately. He was still trying to adjust to the world beyond the hospital, beyond the brutal, life-shattering reality of the shark attack. He had been out of the hospital for just a few days now, but every moment felt like a struggle to reclaim a sense of normality. His body had healed the cuts, the bruises, the wounds from the shark's assault. All of it was fading into the past. But the memories, the fear, that was something different entirely. "Yeah," Mike said finally, his voice thick with a quiet bitterness. "It used to feel like home." Craig, sensing the weight of Mike's words, chose not to press further. Instead, he steered the boat slowly toward the cove that lay just beyond the horizon. It was a quiet spot, sheltered from the open sea, a place Greg had always used to escape. Today, he hoped it would help Mike do the same. Mike sat back against the boat's cushioned seat, his eyes fixed on the water. He hadn't been on the water since the storm that had taken his boat, nearly taken his life. The Gulf had been a predator then, an unforgiving beast that had cast him adrift, left him at the mercy of the elements and, worse, a shark that had stalked him like prey. He could still hear the relentless swish of its tail beneath him, feel the cold terror of knowing that, at any moment, those jaws would close around him and end it all. It had been a week since he had been rescued, a week since the Coast Guard had pulled him from the raft and taken him to safety, a week since he had been discharged from the hospital, and a week since he had first encountered the well-meaning but invasive questions of everyone around him: doctors, friends, reporters. Everyone seemed to want to hear his story. Everyone wanted to know how he had survived, as if his mere existence could somehow make sense of the chaos. Mike had given them their answers: how the shark circled the raft, how he had fought back, how the storm had nearly killed him, how he thought he was going to die more times than he cared to remember. That he had never given them the truth. He hadn't told them how the memories haunted him, how the darkness of the Gulf had somehow become his own, how the water, once a our sea of freedom, now terrified him. Greg cut the engine, and the boat glided silently into the cove. The place was peaceful, too peaceful, Mike thought. There were no other boats, no signs of life, just the quiet lapping of the water against the shore and the occasional cry of a distant gull. The perfect place to forget. For a moment, the silence was almost unbearable. "You sure you want to do this?" Greg asked, looking over at Mike. His eyes were sincere but guarded, as if he was trying to gauge whether this was a good idea. Mike turned his head slowly, staring at Greg. It had been Greg who had suggested this little outing, saying you would help Mike put the past behind him. It had been Greg who had insisted that returning to the water might help Mike find closure, a way to conquer the fear that still clenched at his chest. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this. The ocean, what if I can't do it? What if I can't go back to it?" Greg didn't reply immediately. Instead, he pulled a small cooler from beneath the seat and handed it to Mike, a silent invitation to share a beer. Mike took the bottle but didn't drink it. His hand shook slightly as he held it, his fingers brushing the cold glass as if it might snap in his grasp. "Mike," Greg said, his voice more serious now, "I don't know what you're feeling. I can't pretend to. But I've known you long enough to know that you're not the type to quit. You're not the type to run away from something, even if it scares the hell out of you." Mike looked at him, a flicker of something resembling a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah? Well, sometimes I wish I could be that type." Greg chuckled, though the sound was strained. "We all do, but you've been through something out there that most people will never experience. You've survived what would have killed a lot of people. And now you're here. You're alive. That counts for something." Mike didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The words Greg had said to him since the rescue: survival, strength, resilience, had all been hollow to Mike. What did it mean to be strong when you felt like you were falling apart inside? What did it mean to survive if the thing you survived had already broken you? But he didn't want to say that to Greg. He didn't want to disappoint him, not after everything Greg had done to get him back. So instead, he took a long drink from the bottle, the cold beer sliding down his throat in a slow, deliberate gulp. "You're right," Mike said finally after a long pause. "I can't let it win. I can't let it define me." Greg raised his bottle in a silent toast. "That's the spirit." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower into the horizon. Mike could feel the tension slowly leaving his shoulders, the calming presence of the cove doing what words couldn't. It was strange how something so simple, a quiet cove, a cold beer, and the steady rhythm of the ocean could start to settle his mind. But then, as if to remind him of the darkness beneath the surface, the memory hit him like a slap in the face. The shark, the way it had circled him, watching him, waiting, the way it had breached the water, its jaws snapping just inches from his face. Mike's breath hitched as the images flooded back. The pressure in his chest grew as he remembered the weight of the ocean around him, the isolation, the helplessness. Greg noticed immediately. "Mike, you okay?" Mike's hand trembled as he set the bottle down, his breath growing shallow. The memory was too vivid, too real. His pulse quickened as the weight of what had happened crashed over him. "No," Mike whispered. "No, I'm not okay." Greg's expression shifted, but he didn't push Mike. He simply remained still, giving Mike space to breathe. "I can't do it," Mike said, his voice barely audible. "I can't go back out there. Not like this." Greg stood and walked over to where Mike sat. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him. And for the first time in weeks, Mike let himself feel the enormity of everything. The fear, the shame, the terror of the water that had once been his refuge. "I don't know what you saw out there," Greg finally said, his voice steady. "But I know that you're here, and I know that you're not giving up. You're not the kind of man who lets something like that take everything from him." Mike laughed bitterly, his voice cracking. "I'm not the kind of man who lets it take everything." "Took everything, Greg. I'm not the same guy who got in that boat. I'm not the same guy who thought he could handle anything the sea threw at him." Greg's hand landed firmly on Mike's shoulder, the grip both grounding and reassuring. "You are the same guy, Mike, but the world's different now and you've got a choice. You can either let it swallow you whole or you can fight it. You can decide who you are now, not the shark, not the water. You decide." Mike's gaze drifted out to the water, his thoughts whirling. He wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't sure if he could ever be ready to face that expansive water again. But then he realized something deep in his chest that pushed the panic away, if only just for a moment. He wasn't ready, but maybe that was the point. It wasn't about being ready. It was about facing the fear. It was about the choice to live, to step forward, no matter how broken you felt. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay," Mike said quietly, turning to Greg. "But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to stop running from it." Greg gave a single nod, his eyes filled with quiet approval. That's all anyone can ask for. They spent the rest of the evening talking, the shadows growing long as the sun dipped below the horizon. Mike didn't know what the future held or how long it would take him to heal, but for the first time since the shark had attacked, he felt something resembling peace. It wasn't closure, it wasn't the end, but it was a start, and for Mike Thorne that was enough. The Gulf of Mexico stretched before Mike Thorne, its vast expanse seeming both endless and oppressive. He stood on the edge of the dock, his feet firmly planted on solid ground, but his mind was still tethered to the water. The memories of the storm, the capsizing of his boat, and the relentless attack of the tiger shark were vivid, constantly at the forefront of his thoughts. Despite the clarity of the bright, sunny day, the shadows of the past clung to him like a second skin. "You ready to go out there?" Greg asked, his voice casual but carrying an undercurrent of concern. Greg stood beside Mike, leaning against the rusted wooden railing of the dock, arms crossed, watching him closely. It had been 2 weeks since Mike's rescue, and Greg had offered to take him out to the water once again. It wasn't a push, just an invitation, a gentle nudge to face what had happened. Mike didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air, tasting the familiar tang of the sea. He had been back to the Gulf a few times since his release from the hospital, but each time he had stood on the shore hesitating. The water felt different now, tainted by the memories of his near-death experience. The horizon seemed unreachable, too vast to ever feel safe again. "No," Mike said, his voice low. He finally spoke, but the words felt like they were caught in his throat. He tried to push them out but couldn't find the strength to sound certain. "I don't know if I can." Greg nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know it's not easy, but you can't run from it forever, Mike. The water of the shark, it's all still out there, but you have to choose how you let it affect you." Mike's hand gripped the dock railing tightly. The memories of the shark's dorsal fin slicing through the water, of the terrifying force of its strikes against his raft, of the chilling certainty that death was moments away, all of it flooded back. He could still feel the water pressing against his skin, the fear that had held him captive for so long. He turned to Greg, his eyes weary, full of unspoken fears. "What if I can't do it? What if I can't go back out there and face it?" Greg's face softened, and he placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. "You don't have to face it all at once. You go out there when you're ready. You start small. You let the sea remind you of who you are, who you were before everything changed." Mike looked out at the water, the waves breaking gently against the shoreline. The sunlight reflected off the surface, creating a glittering sheen that seemed almost inviting. But the thought of stepping back into the boat, of facing the open sea, paralyzed him. "I'm afraid," Mike admitted quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the breeze. "I'm afraid I'll never be the same, that I'll never be able to trust it again." Greg gave a slow nod, the lines on his face deepening as he understood the weight of Mike's words. "Trust is hard to come by, especially when it's been shattered. But you're here, you're still alive, and that's worth something. You're not the same, Mike, but that doesn't mean you're broken." The boat rocked gently as they set out from the dock. Mike's hands gripped the sides of the small vessel as Greg steered them out into deeper water. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound between them, but it was the silence of an understanding unspoken. Mike's gaze swept over the water, the vastness of the Gulf stretching out before him. It looked deceptively peaceful, its surface calm and undisturbed. It wasn't the raging tempest he had faced during the storm, but something about its serenity made it all the more haunting. It was almost like a predator waiting to pounce, hiding beneath the stillness. "I never wanted to be here again," Mike said, his voice barely audible, as if confessing a secret. "It felt safe the first time. The sea was mine. I was in control. But now, it feels like it could swallow me whole at any moment." Greg turned to him, keeping his hands steady on the wheel. "It's easy to forget how small we are out here," he said, his voice low. "The sea doesn't care about us, Mike. It's indifferent, but that doesn't mean we're powerless. We're not helpless in the face of it." Mike nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The memory of the shark's relentless pursuit was still too fresh in his mind, too vivid. "I thought I could outrun it," Mike muttered, his voice rough. "I thought I could outsmart it. But it was faster, smarter. It hunted me like prey." "It did," Greg agreed, his voice steady. Right, you didn't give up. You fought. You're here because of that. You're not prey, Mike. You're a survivor. Mike's chest tightened at the word. Survivor. It had been hard to wrap his mind around it. The shark had been something he couldn't control, something that had shown him just how fragile his life was. He hadn't wanted to face it, to confront the fear that it had planted in him. He had spent days, weeks trying to push it down, to bury the memories, but they kept resurfacing. Do you ever think about the things that scared you most? Mike asked, his voice distant. The things that made you feel small, like you didn't matter? Greg glanced over at him, his expression unreadable. I think everyone has something that scares them, Mike. Something that makes them feel small. It's what you do with that fear that counts. Mike's eyes fell to the water beneath them, the dark expanse of it, endless and consuming. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to move forward. Greg took a deep breath, the wind ruffling his hair. You don't have to know right now. They're out here. That's a start. The boat drifted farther from shore, and for a moment, the vastness of the sea seemed to close in around them. Mike's hands still gripped the boat's sides tightly, his knuckles white. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath them, something waiting to pull him under. Greg cut the engine, letting the boat glide into a slow, steady drift. The only sound now was the soft lapping of the water against the hull, the gentle rocking of the boat as it moved with the current. You ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't been there? Mike asked, his voice quiet but edged with uncertainty. If I had just stayed on my own? Greg shook his head, the lines of his face softening as he looked out at the horizon. You were never alone out there, Mike. Not really. The sea might feel big, but you were never truly alone. And I'll tell you this, if it had been anyone else, anyone less determined, they wouldn't have made it. You did. Mike stared at the water, the stillness almost suffocating. I didn't do it alone, he said quietly. I wouldn't have made it without you. Greg didn't reply, but his eyes met Mike's, understanding passing between them. There was no need for more words. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about connection, about not letting fear steal away everything that had once mattered. As the day wore on, the boat drifted farther from the shore, the coastline becoming a distant memory. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. The vastness of the sea seemed to stretch on forever, and Mike felt a mixture of awe and fear as he watched the waves. It was beautiful in a way that was almost painful, so infinite, so overpowering. You know, Greg said, breaking the silence, I spent most of my life on this water. Seen storms, seen sharks, seen people make it and not make it. The one thing I've learned is that no one ever really leaves the sea behind. You can't. It's always there. Mike nodded, his eyes on the horizon. I don't want it to be the thing that defines me anymore. I don't want to live in fear of what happened. Greg placed a hand on the wheel and gave Mike a reassuring look. Then don't. You're the one who gets to decide what it means. Mike's chest tightened, but there was a small flicker of something inside him, something fragile but strong. He had been running from the sea, from the memories, but maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to stop fighting it. I think I can do that, Mike said, his voice barely a whisper, but there was a sense of finality in his words. Greg smiled, the kind of smile that spoke volumes without saying a word. Good. It's a hell of a way to live, Mike, but it's yours. As the sun sank below the horizon, the last light of the day bathed the water in gold. The boat drifted slowly, the gentle sway of the sea a reminder that things were never truly still, that the world was always in motion. But for the first time since the shark's attack, Mike didn't feel like he was being pulled under. The water no longer felt like a predator, it felt like part of the world he had once loved. I'm ready to move on, Mike whispered to no one in particular, but he said it with conviction, as if the words themselves were enough to mark a turning point. And as the last light of day faded into darkness, Mike felt a sense of peace wash over him. The kind of peace that could only come from finally facing the depths not just of the sea, but of himself.